normally when we think about a central dogma, at least me, you might start to think, well, if we have a central dogma or something that is in one way, shape, or form the most important, that everything else must flow forth from it, and it must be the antecedent to every other doctrine. And that's something that Bavinck wrestled with himself. And you do note that Bavinck identifies Christology as the central dogma of his system, but you also, interestingly, demonstrate that the doctrine of Christ is not the starting point, but something Bavinck called the middle point. So what does he mean by that middle punct? Or I might not be getting that foreign. My German might be influencing my lack of Dutch here, but what does that middle point mean, and how is that the case? How does that work? How did Bavinck eventually come to express that notion?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is a very interesting question. He invents this distinction between a center and a starting point. And one of the things I just do in the book is to draw attention to the fact that in Dutch, the word for center and middle point is like a midpoint. And while it's perfectly legitimate to translate that as center, the contrast he's drawing starts to become a little clearer when you can see he's wanting to distinguish between something that is the center and something which is the starting point. So if you think of a circle, the starting point is actually the center. That's where it governs the circumference. So he's wanting to distinguish between something which is at the center and then something which governs theology. And he's very reluctant to say that that can be Christology, because he wants to say that Scripture is the final authority. Therefore, Scripture is the starting point. Scripture is, and he's maintaining the old confession of the authority of Scripture, which even people like Martin Kehrler, who are very much opposed to the radical developments in historical Jesus and liberal theology as we might think of it, even Martin Kehrler feels that he can't defend the authority of Scripture. So there's this white-knuckled resolve to leave Scripture where it is as the final authority. And that starts to make a little bit more sense when you press into the idea of central dogma. One of the things that comes up pretty quickly is this language of a formal and material principle. Unfortunately, it's quite confusing because the way these people use this category of formal and material principle is the opposite of Aristotle's categories.
Whoops.
So you think of a formal principle, what they mean is actually, the authoritative source for theology, and then material principle is the main idea which governs, the synthesizing of the biblical witness. And so these two ideas, Scripture being the formal principle, and as Bavinck would like it to be, Christology is the material principle. This is the kind of distinction which he's drawing on to articulate Christology as the center, but not the starting point. So he wants to keep Scripture as the starting point of theology, but Christology as the central dogma or center. But what's the most interesting thing is that in this way of thinking that Schweitzer pioneers particularly, is that he will analyze Lutheran theology as having, justification as the material principle. And Reformed theology has predestination as the material principle. Now, Bavinck fully embraces this way of thinking about historical theology. He thinks it's a great development. It's well worth pursuing. But the fact that he identifies Christology as the center of his system immediately sets him apart from traditional understandings, or at least the new understanding of the Lutheran tradition and the Reformed tradition, and immediately aligns him more closely with someone like Schleiermacher. And it's this connection to Schleiermacher which is the most interesting lens to think about how Bavinck is an orthodox theologian, because he's attempting to hang on to Scripture as the sole authority or the sole foundation, but place Christology as the center of his system. So it's a lot of these details, I guess, or fine print in Bavinck actually discloses a very, very interesting theological project in this man.
Mm-hmm.
partly illumined by his own education at Leiden under a thinker like Scholten, partly illumined by his immense work in Reformed Orthodox sources and medieval and patristic sources, but especially influenced by his engagement with people like Schweitzer and the ethical theologians at the end of the 19th century.